Hello there. Following on from the very sad and well publicised death of Dr. Gail Milligan, I've decided to do a short episode on why it's so hard for us to reach out and get help when we're burnt out. For those of you that are not aware or haven't heard of this case, Dr. Milligan was a GP who recently died by suicide. Her husband Chris has openly talked about her death on social media and her descent into burnout. Now, I don't happen to know any more details of the case other than what has been posted publicly, and I'm not going to speculate on the events that led Dr. Milligan to feel that she had no way out other than to take her own life. But what I am going to do is I'm going to talk about some of the possible causes of the higher suicide rates in doctors that we have and why it's so hard for us to reach out for help when we're burnt out. Now, I'm placing this in the context of healthcare professionals, but the reasons why it's so hard to seek help when you're burnt out are equally valid for non medics as well. So, doctors have a suicide rate that is 3 to 5 times higher than the average when compared to the general population. And unlike the general population, women are more at risk than men. A doctor in the UK takes their own life every 3 weeks. 1 in 4 GPs know of another GP who has died by suicide, myself included. 2 healthcare professionals, and this includes doctors, nurses, paramedics, midwives, die by suicide every week in the UK. Every death over and above the average is a preventable tragedy. So, if you're wondering why it's so hard to reach out for help when you're burnt out before you get to that crisis point of thinking about harming yourself, it's important to understand, firstly, the context of the systems that we work in and how they prevent us from reaching out for help, and also how burnout itself prevents us from reaching out for help as well. So, one of the problems that we have as medics is medical working culture. And I think that medical working culture is pretty toxic. It's getting better, but I think that there is still a stigma of mental illness within medical working culture. And so, therefore, when we start to struggle, we tend to blame ourselves and adapt maladaptive coping strategies for managing our stress, including working harder, working longer hours, avoidance of our problems, and self blame. We carry a lot of internalized guilt and blame ourselves, and shame ourselves when we start to struggle. And again, this is not just down to the working culture that we have, but it's also down to our collective shared type A, competitive, perfectionist personality types. Our medical and postgraduate training not only normalizes these traits, but actively encourages them as well. And this is really bad for seeking help when you need to seek help because you're really stressed and overwhelmed. I do see this changing. So, one of my roles at the moment is working for the local medical school, and the medical curriculum at this university is changing. And from day one, the students are taught to be compassionate to themselves and to others, not just their patients. And they really kind of learn from an early stage it's really important to look after themselves and their colleagues as well as their patients. However, this is not changing quickly enough. The next thing to touch on is how our jobs are vocations, and therefore our identities are largely tied up in our jobs. And so when we perceive that we are failing at our job, we see this as a personal failure, and it's really hard to uncouple ourselves from our work. We're also not taught in medical school or in our postgraduate training how to recognize the signs of burnout and overwhelming stress. And so when it happens to us, often we don't have the insight or the knowledge to know what is happening and to get help. Access to drugs and knowledge about methods are also proposed as potential reasons as to the higher suicide rate in doctors. However, what I would say to that is that while certainly I do know of perhaps a couple of hospital based doctors who have used having access to drugs and medications to harm themselves or to take their own lives, actually the majority don't appear to use access to medication and drugs to do that. And therefore, I think that proposed argument might not have that much basis in fact. But that's just my opinion. In doing a lot of reading about burnout, I've come across this concept of the recovery paradox, and I'm just going to talk a little bit about what that is. Research suggests that when people's bodies and minds need to recover and reset the most from stress, that is the point that they are least likely to be able to do something about it. When work is demanding, stressful, overwhelming, what people tend to do, and medics especially, is revert to a negative cycle of working more and taking fewer breaks. And for us as medics, this is what we've been taught from day one, isn't it? In medical school, if you've got a problem, if you don't know how to fix something, you just work harder. And if you're going through a stressful time, you're also less likely to look after yourself outside of work and inside of work. You're less likely to eat healthily, even though it's really important that you do take your breaks and to make sure that you're eating properly and hydrating yourself properly. You're much less likely to do it, and therefore your energy levels are not restored when you're feeling stressed at work. So, further depleted, we have less energy and motivation to take time out to relax or engage in exercise or eating healthily, which means that we don't recover properly from our stress, and in turn, further exhaustion the next day. And you can see that this cycle just perpetuates itself. This is the recovery paradox. And to overcome it, what you have to do is you have to break out of those negative and maladaptive coping strategies and to devise your own kind of bespoke recovery plan to recover from burnout. And so if you're stuck in the recovery paradox, what you have to do is you have to recognize that what you think you're doing for your stress recovery isn't actually helping you and that you need to change it up. I think that the recovery paradox is one of the reasons why it's so hard to reach out for help, because you think that you're helping yourself, but actually you're not. You're stuck in this cycle and you are, in fact, harming yourself even more. The next thing to touch on is how burnout changes your brain. And burnout changes your brain in a way that is really significant, and it does stop you from reaching out for help. It changes your structure and function, and these changes are significant. For instance, your emotional regulation changes, so you cannot control your physical and emotional responses to stress as compared to when you were healthy or compared to healthy controls. Your cognition also slows. The normal aging processes in the brain speed up. Now, unless you have experienced this, I think it is really difficult to truly understand the impact that burnout has on your thinking. When I look back to my own burnout, my symptoms were incredibly significant and they were utterly devastating. And the only way I can describe what it felt like to exist in my head at that point, at the height of my burnout, was that it was utterly exhausting and absolutely desperate. I didn't recognize who I was or what I had become. I was so far removed from pre-burnout Claire. I was a completely different person. I'd lost all confidence in myself. And I think that, when you're in that place and your thinking is that disordered, it becomes easier to understand how those thoughts might turn to self-harm or to suicide. But it's not the fault of the person that's burnt out, because the burnt out brain is very different to the pre-morbid brain. So if you're not likely to reach out for help when you're massively burnt out, might your colleagues or your loved ones realise? Well, I think the first thing to say about this is that when you reach a crisis point, first of all, you're very likely to still be working, as it was for Dr. Milligan. And this is because this is what people with burnout do, right? So one of the features of burnout is reduced professional efficacy. So what that means really in simple terms is reduced performance at work. But that doesn't necessarily mean, for instance, in the context of healthcare, that you're making more mistakes or harming patients. Actually, in healthcare, people with burnout think that they're making more mistakes, but actually they're not. What this means in reality is that, you might be slower at making decisions, your performance might be reduced, your cognition might be slow, but this might not have been noticed by your colleagues. And the chances are that if you're suffering with burnout, or if you've got a colleague with burnout, that you'll still, at least on the surface, appear to be functioning at work. You will still be turning up to work and still be doing your job. So the burnout might not be recognised by the person who has burnout, but it also is not likely to be recognised by others at work. And I think it's just important to say that just because someone is turning up and doing their job doesn't mean that they're not burnt out to a crisp or that they're not deeply suffering. One of the stages of burnout, if you look at kind of the psychological theories behind it, is that your loved ones do notice at some point into the descent into burnout that you are struggling. However, even if you say something to the person that's burnt out, they might not have the insight yet to recognize what is happening, or they might not accept it. And so whilst loved ones and people that are close to the person who have burnout might notice, it doesn't necessarily mean that the burnout who has it will accept this and reach out for help. And I think sometimes it's really difficult when you're in that cycle of burnout to realize it before you get to a crisis point. And a crisis point means something different for different people. For me, it was, and I know the crisis point because I remember it so vividly, it was pretty much having a panic attack down the phone to my husband over a tiny issue. I'd never had a panic attack before in the past, and that for me was the wake up point. But before that, there had been a period perhaps of a couple of months where I'd been really struggling, but I hadn't recognized it. For other people, the crisis point, unfortunately, might be self-harm. And so what we have to do is we have to start to learn to recognize the signs of burnout in ourselves and in our colleagues so that we can stop it before we get to that point. Now, I do think that there is some good news with regards to medical working culture. I do see it changing. I think that we're having a lot more conversations about mental health, mental well-being. I think that people do try really hard now to look out for their colleagues as well, as long as you're working in a functional department. But it's really difficult, to be there for your colleagues and to recognize the signs of burnout in them if you're really stressed and struggling with burnout yourself. We do know that more doctors are reaching out for help now, and they are getting help as well. So practitioner health, for instance, I couldn't find the exact data, but I do believe that GPs now are referring themselves to practitioner health at a rate 9 times higher than pre-pandemic. So there are signs that people are now starting to reach out and ask for help at an earlier stage, which is great. The numbers are less reassuring, and there is a crisis within healthcare at the moment with burnout, unfortunately. But I think that until the systemic pressures that are on us are tackled, healthcare professionals and other professionals will continue to burn out and we will continue to suffer. And therefore, I think what we need to do is come together, all allied professionals, to put pressure on our leaders, on our managers, on the government to make changes, fundamental changes to the systemic pressures, how the NHS is run and funded in particular. And the other thing is that we need patients on side. So whilst healthcare professionals who are burnt out, the data shows that whilst they think they make more mistakes, they actually aren't. They're not causing patients harm, according to the evidence. The systems that burn doctors out, that burn out other healthcare professionals, are not safe for patients. And ultimately, patients will come to harm as a result of working in systems that have so much pressure, that are so overwhelmed, so under-resourced, so understaffed. And therefore, this is an issue about patient safety as well. And I think the way to put pressure on the powers that be is to get patients on board, have unity, patients and healthcare professionals together, so that we can change things from the top down. It's not good enough to have change from the bottom up. It has to be a united front. So those were some of my thoughts about why it's so hard to reach out from when you're burnt out, and I hope that that's been helpful. Any questions, please let me know in the comments, or feel free to come and join my Facebook group. I'm the Burnout Doctor on Facebook. Very happy to take questions in there. Take care.